I rise to speak in support of the Murphy-Paul-Franken resolution of disapproval and to outline my concerns for the unfettered sale of arms to Saudi Arabia. The Saudi-led war in Yemen has created a humanitarian disaster in one of the region's poorest countries. Many thousands of civilians have been killed, many more made homeless, and millions are at the risk of starvation, according to the United Nations Refugee Agency. The chaos in Yemen has also been strategically disastrous for the United States, providing fertile ground for the extremist groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS and creating new opportunities for Iranian intervention. In addition to being morally indefensible and strategically short-sighted, the Trump administration's unconditional support for the Saudi coalition, including billions of dollars in arms sales, risks dragging the United States into yet another war in the Middle East. These are the reasons why I strongly support the resolution of disapproval offered by my colleagues and their effort to block some of these arms sales to Saudi Arabia. But, Mr. President, I also think it is long past time that we begin to take a very hard look at our relationship with Saudi Arabia. This is a country that is run by a hereditary monarchy in which women are treated as third-class citizens. I would just like to mention for a moment the case of Lujain al-Hathloul, a Saudi Arabian human rights activist who was arrested at King Fahd International Airport on June 4th. She has been an advocate for women's rights in Saudi Arabia. In 2014, she was arrested for defying the country's ban, are you ready for this, on women drivers, and imprisoned for 73 days. In 2015, she ran as a candidate in a local council election, the third in the nation's modern history, and the first in which women were allowed to both vote and run, even though her name was never added to the ballot. More recently, Hathloul criticized a Saudi government-sponsored Women's Empowerment Summit, which was attended by Ivanka Trump, for its lack of inclusiveness. While she has now been released from jail, and I'm very glad to hear that, this is no way to treat a peaceful dissident. Mr. President, the human rights organization Amnesty International reported that during her detention, Hathloul was not allowed access to an attorney, nor was allowed to speak to her family. Mr. President, finally, and perhaps most significantly, it is important that here on the floor of the Senate, we begin to discuss the decades-long effort by Saudi Arabia to export an ultra-reactionary form of Islam throughout the world. A recent piece in the Boston Globe by Stephen Kinzer, a journalist who has covered the Middle East for many years, and I would like to ask unanimous consent to have that article put into the journal, Mr. President.
Without objection.
This article by Mr. Kinzer used the example, this is just one example, of Indonesia to demonstrate the incredibly negative impact that Saudi financing has had in many places around the world. And I will quote from his article, quote, "Saudi Arabia has been working for decades to pull Indonesia away from moderate Islam and toward the austere Wahhabi form that is state religion in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis' campaign has been patient, multifaceted, and lavishly financed. it mirrors others they have waged in Muslim countries across Asia and Africa. Successive American presidents have assured us that Saudi Arabia is our friend and wishes us well. Yet we know that Osama bin Laden and most of his 9/11 hijackers were Saudis, and that, as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton wrote in a diplomatic cable 8 years ago, quote, donors in Saudi Arabia constitute the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide, end of quote. Recent events in Indonesia shine a light on a Saudi project that is even more pernicious than financing terrorists. Saudi Arabia has used its wealth, much of which comes from the United States, to turn entire nations into hotbeds of radical Islam. By refusing to protest or even officially acknowledge this far-reaching project, we finance our own assassins and global terror. End of quote from that excellent article from the Boston Globe. Mr. President, we all understand that there are times when we must work with problematic governments in order to advance our security goals. But for far, far too long, we have been giving a pass to a government in Saudi Arabia that supports ideas and policies that are fundamentally at odds with American values and that have led to extremely negative consequences for American security. I think the time has come for the United States Congress to take a very, very hard look at this relationship and assess whether it is actually serving the interests and values of the American people. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.